want you to welcome Mark Kiel. Mark Kiel.
Hi, everybody. I don't know what I look like to you, but I'm actually a doctor. I'm in fact a double doctor. I have both an MD and a PhD degree. And my friends and family sometimes call me Dr. Mark. But they usually do it when I'm struggling to put together IKEA furniture or when I've done something dumb like tried to shred a document in a dehumidifier. So I have those two degrees. One is a medical degree and the other is a research degree. And in the lab, I studied how stem cells made life. I was a data scientist, so I was most comfortable looking at spreadsheets that were so big they crashed my computer, or spending hours in a microscope closet counting colored dots on glass slides. But every once in a while, I got to do what we called wet experiments, which was with cells or worse, animals. And I remember one of those experiments, I made heart cells beat in a petri dish. And I would just look with wonder at those cells beating in that dish. So I was learning all that, and then I entered into the clinical world. And in the clinical world, I learned how cancer kills. So I remember rounding on my patients one morning in my short white coat that students wore that signified we didn't know anything. And we had rounded on our patients, and we heard over the PA that there was a code. And I don't know if you know that is not good. It means that one of the patients was dying. Her heart had stopped, and she was a patient on our team. So the attending physician rounded up the students, and we all lined up outside the room while we watched this code take place. And it's not like TV. It's more dramatic, but dozens of medical professionals descended into this room, and they started doing chest compressions and calling out vitals and trying to ventilate this patient who was dying in front of our eyes. And I was watching in the back because I could only watch. There was nothing I could do. And I remember seeing the patient's mother in the corner of the room. And she was stone-faced, and I can only imagine what she was thinking. And I was so far back that I could see the hallway, and I saw the patient's husband, who'd presumably been called, and he came up the hallway. And when he got to the room, he did a double take at the number because he just could not believe that that was his wife. And so you can imagine how the students were affected. We hadn't seen anything like that before, and believe me, I never want to again. But we have an attending physician who is in charge of the students, somebody we look up to, somebody who corrects our stupid mistakes. But when he saw that this had happened and he saw the effect that it had on us, he rounded us up and he took us down to the cafeteria. And it sounds silly, but he bought us all ice cream. And I remember leaving the hospital that day at the end of what you could consider to be work. And I stopped in the parking structure in the stairwell, and I just sat down. And I was all alone, and there were no colleagues around, and I just cried. I just felt so helpless. So that was one of the few times that I've cried in my adult life. We'll get to the next one in a minute. But fast forward, I'm a geneticist. I study genomics. And genomics is the science of how the 3 billion letters of our DNA make us all unique. But sometimes those letters can cause disease. And in my research, I studied what those letters meant. And I sought to find treatment for my patients, like the patient that I just described. So when I entered graduate school, it cost $3 billion to sequence a patient's DNA. And it took a decade. And as I was leaving graduate school, there were a couple of companies that had figured out how to make that happen in a day for $1,000. And that wasn't even the hard part. The real hard part was making sense of that and figuring out what that meant, and that's what my research did. So you can imagine if Google had gone to med school and got a doctorate in genetics. That was the kind of software that I built. And genomics, while I was going through this phase in my career, was taking off, and it was all at the hands of startup companies. It was all because of industry. And if I wanted to make a tangible difference in genomics, I knew that I had to get in that game. And so during the 3 decades of my training as a student, I abandoned my dream of becoming a professor, and I adopted the dream of becoming an entrepreneur. So this was like taking a U-turn at 30,000 feet. And believe me, my wife thought I'd lost my mind. But I was truly convinced that I was the only one who could make this dream I had a reality, and that starting a company was the only way I could do it. So I founded a company, and I called it Genomenon. I'm a bit of a nerd, so it's Greek, and it means it had to be born. And I had university professors for my training, and they contributed to the company, but they weren't about to quit their day jobs. And so I found a co-founder. And my co-founder and I, in the basement of an old brewery, believe it or not, we would whiteboard our ideas in the morning and argue and make up and have more ideas. And then at night, we would code those ideas to life on his laptop. And my brother, I have an identical twin brother, who's in many ways much smarter than me because he started having a career about a decade before I did. He's a patent attorney, and his bonuses are much more than my salaries ever were. But he gave us some money for a prototype. And I was so grateful to him because I knew how hard he worked for that money. And it really meant something to me because I'd never had any of my own. And I felt for the first time that this was truly a reality, and it was make or break for me. It was really do or die. And earlier I had figured out how to get some money from the university to support the research that we were doing, but it was never enough to keep the lights on. And so I had to go for broke, and I started writing an application for a very large grant. I practically lived in the library while I was writing this grant, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., just writing through lunch. And then in the evenings, I would continue writing, looking at the data, and making figures for this grant. But this is like a lottery level long shot grant, so fewer than 1 in 5 of these grants even gets considered for funding. So I knew that I had to make other plans. And so I refined my investor pitch deck, and I got really good at PowerPoint, where I first spoke from prepared notes that I would read. Later on, I won awards for the pitches that I gave. And I wrote a really convincing business plan that even convinced some of those investors to give me money. Some of them are here, so I'm trying to watch what I say. I'm very grateful for you. The people I'm talking about in this little anecdote aren't here, but I remember one meeting. We were having lunch. It was me and I think 4 investors. And it's literally the case that they were talking about yacht maintenance. Their own yachts, and then the conversation meandered to where they were going to travel for the summer in Europe or Mars or whatever. And I was sitting there just listening patiently, and I was petrified that they weren't going to pick up the lunch bill because I had maxed out 2 credit cards and I had 16 cents in my debit account. They didn't give me money. I didn't really want it, but I did get money from investors for the company, and from that money I gave myself a salary, a small salary to support my wife and myself. And I was comfortable with spreadsheets, but not the kind with dollar signs in them. So, not at all. And so I needed to have a little bit of extra help, and so a very good friend of mine with finance experience, he joined our cause. And he took care of many of the aspects of the business while I focused on the other aspects, like the science. But gradually, word got out about what we were doing, and we had perfect strangers come to us and want to be part of the mission that we were starting. There was one of them whose visa I had sponsored, so he could stay in the United States. And we even supported his trip back to his home country to get married. And me and some of my employees, we would go to trade shows and show customers or potential customers our software. And these were big name customers, names that if I said them, which I won't, you would probably recognize. It even got so good that another name that you would recognize offered to buy our company. I felt like we were just newborn. And this person had us fly out to Chicago on a private jet. And at the meeting, he made an offer for the company, and I turned him down. And later on, on a phone call, he doubled his offer, and I still turned him down. It seems kind of brazen to say now, but I genuinely felt at the time that we had so much potential that we could live up to. And while all this was going on, this is a group of entrepreneurs, you'll recognize fully that life is going on while you're being an entrepreneur. My wife and I were trying to have a child. She had always wanted a big family, and I had always envisioned myself being a dad. And I'm a doctor, so I knew what to do, and she got pregnant. And then, so I had my first board meeting. So I want you guys to imagine that everything is going great. And I had my first board meeting, and we had these really expensive deli sandwiches catered, and people were laughing at my jokes, even though it was a tough crowd. And people were smiling when I talked about our conversations with customers, and they nodded when I put up our financial projections. And my lawyer came up to me afterwards, and she said that was the best first board meeting she had ever been part of. But it didn't count for much because I was paying her to be there. But this whole time, this was many months, I was just elated, and everything was going right. And I felt like I was flying. And I made the mistake of asking myself what could possibly go wrong. And so there were things that went wrong. After 7 months, having had raised this money, we were starting to run out. I had made a very common first-time entrepreneur mistake that second-time entrepreneurs don't make. I had underraised and overspent. I had overpromised and underdelivered. And where we were impressing these customers, the market just wasn't ready to give us money. And so the board and I discussed things, and we had a couple months to live, and the company was on life support. So my second board meeting went a little different than the first. People in the audience will remember. There were no sandwiches. There were no smiles. And my lawyer came to me in the hallway, and she said that was the worst board meeting she'd ever been part of. And we had to fire her because we had no money. And the employee whose visa I had sponsored just a couple months before, we had to let him go too. And I remember the same sort of helpless, hollow feeling when I had to deliver the news. I could just faintly feel my heart beating in my chest, but I couldn't feel anything else. He and his wife had to go back to their home country, and I was devastated because I felt like instead of saving people's lives, I wound up ruining them. So the board, God bless them, they started helping me because I needed it as a first-time entrepreneur. They put some restrictions in place about spending. We stayed at some very questionable Airbnbs, sharing a futon, and having customer meetings that were make or break. And they never made. My salary was cut. I remember my finance friends sent me an email with a subject line that said, "The direness of our situation." And that was really what I felt like. My sleep became extremely restless, and I was tossing and turning, and my wife kicked me out of bed because she said it wasn't good for the baby. So I was going through the motions of life, trying to keep the company and myself alive during the day, and then at night I tried meditating. I don't know if you guys have any whale sounds that you can play. That was what I'd listen to. So I was out of my bedroom on the floor of our unfinished nursery with my earbuds, just listening to these whales, talking to each other with their distant whistles, and I felt like they were talking to me. And then, that's awesome. That's awesome. So two very bad things happened while I was going through this procedure. It was almost an out-of-body experience. On a customer call, the best prospect we had, we were told that there was some structural reorganization and that they wouldn't be able to purchase for a couple quarters. Again, I was on the floor, and I talked to the board, and they started to lose confidence, and they started talking about aborting the company. And on another conversation with another customer, I got a text from my wife, and it said, "Come home." And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Just come home. There's something wrong." And so later that week, we learned that our baby's heart had stopped beating. And we lost her. So a lot of people don't appreciate that affects fathers too. And so I was with my whales, and they were talking to me, and I felt like I was talking to them. And I would think about unicorns, the billion-dollar startups that everybody reads about and hopes for, and I just could not stop thinking about these whales, these oceans of startups that had failed, and I was worried that that was going to happen to my company. But fast forward a week of this, and I don't know what happened, but I said to myself, "What the fuck are you doing? You're talking to whales that aren't even there. You were on a billionaire's jet who wanted to buy your company for several $1,000,000, and now you're talking to whales in the dark." And so I fired myself. In many ways, I feel like a startup is like a baby. It's fragile, and it's frustrating, and it's needy, but it's awesome and full of potential. And I talked myself into the idea that if I couldn't be the parent that Genomenon needed yet, I would find the person who could. And so I looked for my own replacement, and I found that person. And I feel like I'm learning from him about being an entrepreneur because he's been through this before and made the same stupid mistakes that he wouldn't make again. And he and I raised more money from investors who believed in us. And we started converting those customers. And then we started converting more customers. And that grant that I wrote, that long shot lottery grant, I won that grant. It was from the government, so it took a whole long time to get it, but we got it. When I was in med school, we learned from patients, and one of my patients was a patient lecturer, and she got up on stage in front of 200 med students, and she told us her story about going through her experience of having a child with a genetic disorder. And this obviously still sticks in my mind, but she said it was like she had been preparing her whole life to take a trip to France, learning French, studying the culture, and craving the food, and then finding out in mid-flight that her ticket said Spain. And she said, Spain is still awesome, and there's still a lot to learn from Spain. There's no reason to hijack your own flight just because you're on a different journey. And I feel like that now. I feel very proud of what the board and my new co-pilot have done with the company. One of the first things that we did was make our software freely available so that patients, like the patients I've talked about and countless patients that I haven't, would benefit from the information that we were collecting and the possibility that it was making real. And every day we get letters from doctors who tell us that their patients' lives were improved or saved because of information that only came from our software. So I'm extremely grateful and very proud and thankful to my wife and the board and the investors who believed in me and my colleagues and my coworkers. And when now I'm in my nursery with my wife by my side and I look down at my daughter and how perfectly perfect she is, I feel like for the first time in a long time I know exactly what I'm doing and what I'm doing it for. Thank you.